what I'm going to tell you today is, it's more than disturbing. You're not going to go out of here feeling terribly happy, and I apologize for that in advance, but this is about truth. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had what I call a eureka moment, when suddenly something becomes blindingly clear to you. Well, I had one in the 60s. I was working as a print journalist then and travelling up to Waterloo on the train, and it was such a clear understanding of the world that I can remember the weather, I can remember where I was sitting on the train, where I was out, what was outside, and it was just a little article in The Guardian called Spaceship Earth. And what it did, it compared planet Earth to a spaceship with a certain supply of food, air, waste disposal, and it just said we are living as if we have infinite food, infinite life support, and disposal of what we create, our waste, is of no consequence. It is unsustainable. We cannot continue like this. And I just thought, that is so blindingly obvious. And of course, what it makes you realize is that the whole world has been taken over by a philosophy, one philosophy. There's no other on offer now, and it is consuming. It comes in lots of guises. It's capitalism, it's consumption, it's permanent growth. How on earth, on a planet with finite resources, can you have permanent growth? In other words, every year consuming the world's resources a little bit faster than you did the year before. And that's what we're doing. Now, I mean, all across Europe now, there is turmoil and trouble, and people are being asked to slash their living standards. What's the answer? The answer is coming from every government is identical. We have to grow. We have to grow. In other words, we have to return to consuming the world to death. And this, if ever there was a point in our recent history where we could have done a little reappraisal of where we're going, what we're doing to the planet, this is it. But nobody is doing it. Nobody in power is doing it. The political classes aren't doing it because they don't want to tell people, you're going to have to consume less. Now, we've got a choice. We either start to plan for zero growth, or what we see on the streets of Greece and Spain, and very shortly Italy as well, and here, will get worse. It will be chaotic. So this is really vitally important. What I didn't realize back in the 60s when I had my eureka moment was that at the heart of all this consumption, not probably, but certainly the most important aspect of consumption is meat and dairy. That didn't occur to me until much, much, much later on. But meat and dairy consumption, well, not the actual eating of it, but the animals, the growing of the animals to produce it, is at the heart of all the world's great environmental catastrophes. And I'm talking about deforestation, desertification, turning good land into desert, the degradation of good farmland. I'm not even going to touch on the oceans today because you'll probably go out and hang yourself already. I'll leave the oceans out of it. Antibiotic pollution. Wherever you look, livestock production is at the heart of it all. And there's a simple ratio that gives the understanding for this. Why should they be so destructive? And it's because capitalism prides itself on its efficiency. You know, all public industries have to be privatized to show efficiencies. Farming is the most inefficient way of producing food ever devised because it varies from animal to animal. It can go from about 5 to 1 to 17 to 1, but the average is about 10 to 1. So you have to stuff into animals 10 times as much good quality vegetable protein as you can to produce 1 kilogram of meat protein. And that is what lies at the heart of an unsustainable farming system. And how unsustainable it is really quite extraordinary. Deforestation. It's never been, I mean, in the last 20 years, 30 years perhaps, it's been talked about to such a degree that we've all become bored with it. But you would have thought all this public attention on a major world issue would have had some influence. And last year, more trees were felled than at any time in history. So it's had no effect whatsoever, because what you're asking people to do is to change a political system, not just, not just sort of shout, stop chopping down the trees. Now, the Amazon, that's where most of the focus is. In fact, it's not just the Amazon that's being felled. It's all across the world, from Australia, anywhere where there are forests, Central America as well, they're being felled. And the rate of destruction is 73 million hectares annually. Now, that doesn't mean a lot. Envisage Belgium. That's 3 million hectares. So it's 2.5 times the size of Belgium that's being chopped down every year. Now, once it was for the timber, but you don't need to fell trees at that rate just for the timber. It's no longer for timber at all. And if you look at the Amazon, all the cleared Amazon rainforest land is used for one purpose. It's used for cattle and animal feed. 30% of the cleared Amazon rainforest land is used for growing soybeans to feed to farmed animals, and Europe imports 18 million tons from there alone, from the Amazon alone, every year. It imports it from all over the world, much more than that, but 18 million tons comes from the Amazon. Every chicken nugget, every pork chop, every rasher of bacon plays a direct part in the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. The other 70% rather, is used for grazing cattle. And that's to feed the hamburger culture. It's essentially almost all of it goes to hamburgers. So there we are, a food that nobody actually needs, which is destroying the planet. I don't know if any of you have been into rainforest or spent any time in rainforest. I'm very, very lucky, because a couple of years ago we took 6 months out, took the kids and went to Costa Rica. And I mean, rainforests are amazing places. If you go back a little way, about 30 years, Costa Rica was one of the fastest at chopping down its forests. Under direct instructions from the World Bank, chop down your trees, grow beef for the American market, and we will think about giving you a loan. Well, they wised up. They've now nominated 20 areas of the country as national parks, which is about 1/3 of their rainforest. There will be more as well. But they've suddenly realized that A, you can't go on doing it, but also B, it's very profitable, because people come and see your wonderful parks and forests. But the life in there, it's not very obvious at first. You go into a rainforest and it's quite quiet. And then you suddenly might see a toucan come fluttering past. And look at this ridiculously designed animal that essentially has to fly downhill, and it climbs up a tree and then starts again because of this great big beak. Or you'll hear the raucous sound of a scarlet macaw. If you've ever seen a parrot or a scarlet macaw in a cage, it is probably one of the cruelest things I've ever seen. Those animals in the wild, they fly in this most extraordinary way. They're full of enthusiasm. They squawk and they cry. But I'm digressing now. That's another issue. It's about the abuse of animals. Now, what happens if we keep chopping down forests? Well, we're already seeing it across the world. We're seeing floods because trees absorb water, they hold it, and they release it at a measured rate. Without trees, there is nothing to stop rainfall when it comes down, and so heavy precipitation will just rush off. And what it does, it takes with it the topsoil. Now, the topsoil in a rainforest is very, very thin, and it's not particularly high quality. The reason being that rainforests are nature in absolutely perfect balance. Every animal that poos or wheezes in the forest, every twig or stick that falls to the forest floor, every animal that dies, they all decompose and they're reabsorbed up into the forest. So it doesn't need a huge amount of soil. So what happens when you chop down trees is that for a few years you can grow stuff, or you can graze animals on it, and then when the grazing begins to peter out, you plough it up, throw bucket loads of pesticides and fertilizer at it, and then you can continue to grow soybeans for a few years. But eventually it will go to desert. And I mean, it's just a sort of a very stark reminder. This is not a new problem, deforestation. It's just never happened on this scale. But Hannibal, you know Hannibal who crossed the Alps with his elephants, Do you know where he got his elephants from? From the Sahara. Now, the Sahara was the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. And this ignoring of soil and its structure and what we're doing to it is phenomenally worrying. Deserts are spreading everywhere. I'll try and keep to my script because this is for once being recorded. And so I need to sort of just keep in the right order. We'll edit that bit out, by the way. Yeah, desertification. Around the middle of the Earth is a third of the width of the planet is a band of arid and semi-arid lands. These are 73% degraded, which means that 73% of those lands are on the way to becoming deserts. But it isn't just the fact that deserts are spreading, new deserts are being created. Because of this insistence on growing the same crops year after year on the same soil, dispensing with the processes learnt over millions of years about I've forgotten the word for it now. Sorry? Rotation. Yes, rotation. Thank you. My mind went blank. Rotation doesn't apply anymore. So what you do is you just throw fertilizers at it. And of course you grow lots of crops together. It's heaven for pests because they don't die off at the end of the season when different crops are planted and they can't live on them. So then you have lots and lots of pesticides and you have this endless spiral of fertilizers and pesticides, and something like 49% of all agricultural land is degraded. And again we come back to animals. Of all the agricultural land in the world, 70% of it is used for animals in this extraordinarily inefficient system. 70% of it. Now, you might notice that in this current period of cutbacks and people's wages being slashed and people being put out of work, not a mention about the 34 billion that goes to the EU every year, largely to subsidise farmers to produce livestock. I mean, the craziness of it is just so profound. It's a joke. I'll just give you a little historical story. You know Haiti, it's had everything that can be thrown at it. Earthquakes, it's one of the poorest countries on earth, bedeviled by dictators. The Americans decided that they were going to use Haiti to graze cattle. So what they did, they talked to Papa Doc or whoever took our Baby Doc, and people who were eking out, in existence on small areas, all pushed off. And they grew alfalfa, then they flew cattle from Texas to Haiti, grazed them on the alfalfa, slaughtered them and sent them back as hamburger meat. Now those people who were pushed off the land went on to the marginal lands, which of course are not terribly productive. And they dig them up, and essentially they again destroy, by working the same plots of land over and over again, you get this desertification beginning. Now this is happening all across the world, And the United Arab Emirates, China, Britain, America, we are streaming. We did it first of all through Eastern Europe, buying up land. We're now steaming through Africa, South America, buying up land. And what you're doing, you don't just buy land, because there's no empty land. People live on it, and they have subsistence farming on it. But because the governments can make money out of it, they're pushed off, and most of this land is used to grow fodder. And at the same time, the people who once inhabited it are now on the margins, and you see the whole process of desertification taking place again. And it's just on and on. The area of land that is being bought up by wealthy countries, I can't give you a figure for it, but it is staggering. And it's happening every day, every day, every day. So with forests goes biodiversity, because 60% of all biodiversity, that is plant and animal species, are in the rainforests. So when the forests go, this biodiversity goes as well. Now, I can't really tell you what the outcome of loss of biodiversity is. Nobody knows, because what we're dealing with is an extraordinary balancing act of one creature dependent upon another creature, dependent upon another creature. you just know instinctively that it ain't going to be good. This is not something that the world needs or wants or eventually can live with, because it's not how it was meant to be. So with forest goes plant and animal species, thousands of which have never been catalogued, never been known, and something like 40% of all the drugs you get from your doctor have a base in nature. Like aspirin came from willow bark. And so we're not, it's you know, there's a moral dilemma here. There is also a human dilemma, you know, destroying things we don't even know the value of. Right, what else can I depress you with? What about water use? Again, back to animals. The figures, you can read figures all over the place. And I've seen 100,000 litres of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef. I can't really justify that. Any figures I give you come from peer-reviewed research. And the figure we have is for a kilo of beef, 441, sorry, a pound of beef, these are old figures, 441 gallons of water. By the same token, a kilo of vegetable products, 20 to 30 gallons. Now that's the difference. So in a world where water is running out, we are lavishing it again in a wasteful way on producing livestock. Because it isn't just what they drink, of course, it's the crops that have to be grown for them. And I'll just, if you go to North America, I flew across North America in a little aircraft, which was quite low to the ground. And you look down, and it took me a long time to work this out, which is a bit stupid because it's fairly obvious. All the fields, like across the Dakotas and so on, they're round. They're all absolutely round. And when you're used to flying across Britain and seeing square, higgledy-piggledy patchwork fields, you think, what the heck? And then I could see a big boom. You know, I worked out it was a boom and it was rotating. And of course, it's water. And most of these crops are irrigated. These are on the old rangelands where the buffaloes used to roam. And that water is coming from, mostly from the Oglala aquifer, one of the biggest aquifers in the world. And it's running out. It's taken millions of years to build this reservoir up, this aquifer, and it's running out. America has huge, huge problems with water. It's great big lake, like Lake Mead, which provides water to much of the south of the country. All the rivers, the branches off the Colorado that have been dammed, they're all experiencing problems because not only is the country overusing water, but again, this year it's just had one of the biggest droughts in its history. And something like 33 of North America's states are facing water shortages. And in just a few years, that is going to be much more profound than just water shortages. And the figures for the world, at 2025, 64% of the world's population will be water stressed. That means they won't have enough water to do all the things they need. And then a third of the world's population will face absolute water scarcity. There will be almost no water. And they will be trying to dig boreholes and so on. And of course, until the water table drops, which is dropping now. Just another little thing, you go to West Africa, somewhere like Gambia, where lots of people go on holiday, and you look across the landscape and you'll see some palm trees, and then you'll see loads of palm trees with no tops on. And again, I tried to work out what that was about. And I had to ask in the end, and somebody said, the water table's dropped. And some trees are not reaching the water, so they're dying. Because of the extraction of water, again, it's usually, I mean, it is for other purposes as well, but it's just that the imbalance between what animals require and what plants and vegetables require is just huge. How am I doing for time? I'm not doing terribly well, actually. Antibiotic pollution. Now, we all know about superbugs. There have been 2 new ones discovered in the last 12 months, one in cattle and one in pigs, dairy cattle. How factory farming works is that animals, mostly of the same genetic stock, are crammed together in unhygienic places, and particularly with pigs, which is just, I mean, it's just overcrowding. But dairy cows are not much better off. You know, you see 200 dairy cows on a small area of land, sort of trying to eke out a living on the grass, and they're all pooing on that grass. And they're having milk extracted from them at such a rate that their bodies can't cope. So they're given antibiotics to try and control diseases like mastitis and laminitis. But in fact, pig factory farms, it's a daily occurrence, feeding antibiotics to animals. Until comparatively recently, it was so profligate, they had 3 types of antibiotics. There was one to cure disease, should they get a disease. There was another called prophylactic to ward off disease in case they might get it. And then a third was to make them grow faster, because they found that giving them a particular type of antibiotic killed particular bugs in their stomach, which enabled them to absorb more nutrients from their food and put on weight faster. So they're getting hammered with 3 loads of antibiotics. The EU has now banned growth-promoting antibiotics, so we can all give a nice big round of applause, except we can't, because the consumption of antibiotics hasn't dropped at all. So what the farmers have discovered, or their vets, is that by feeding prophylactic antibiotics instead of growth promoting, it has exactly the same effect. So it's hardly any wonder that you've got these pools of disease that bacteria develop resistance. But more than that, they can pass on. One species of bacteria can pass on resistance to a completely unrelated species. You know, at the end of the day, the bacteria are going to win. Make no mistake about that. You can't beat them because their whole life is to mutate. That's what they do. And 99% of those mutations will die out because they're not successful and they won't survive. But every so often, they will produce a mutation that is not subject to antibiotics, or that particular batch of antibiotics. Now, we've nearly run through the gamut now for some diseases. Some food poisoning diseases, things like E. coli, salmonella, are not responding at all. And TB is one of the big problems. Now, again, we can thank animal agriculture for this. Most people seem to believe, and in fact, you're encouraged to believe, that it's overprescribing by eager doctors, and also the third world, the developing world, where you can go and buy, you know, 1 antibiotic or 2 antibiotics rather than a course. That all does play a part. But America, for instance, the United States of America, 80% of all antibiotics are fed to farmed animals. And there's research from Denmark which shows quite clearly that the major vector in antibiotic resistance is animal farming. Now, I'm going through these, I'm not making these up. This is all peer-reviewed stuff. And every time I read these out, I want to actually go and bang my head against the wall. Because politicians have their only interest is getting re-elected. Almost everything they do is aimed at getting them re-elected. Telling you that sorry chaps, we're going to treble the price of meat to save the planet and to save the health service. There'll be, you know, they're afraid there'll be more revolutions on the streets. And so they say, oh, forget about that, push that to one side. And also the farmers elect us, so particularly the Tories. So it just goes on and on. Let somebody else deal with it further down the line. And I'm rushing a bit because of time, but I'm going to come on to another one now, which I haven't mentioned, and which has been more or less shoved off the agenda by global warming. Now, sadly, if you see an article on global warming in one of the daily papers and then go to the comments that people have made online, it's almost all saying this is a load of tosh. Global warming doesn't exist. Now, how this myth has got perpetrated, I don't know, but there's even some in our own movement now. And it seems you've got to buy into a bagload of myths. It's part and parcel of rejecting society, that planes didn't fly into the Twin Towers. They were blown up by the American CIA. And that the World Health Organization's vaccination program is inserting microchips to control people. Now, you don't need to go looking for for conspiracies, because they exist. And one of the biggest conspiracies is keeping you eating meat and dairy. Now, in case there are any doubters about global warming, there's no doubt. Now, there are 35 big scientific institutions in the world. Things like the Royal Society in London, the National Academy of Sciences in America. 34 of those institutions are in no doubt that global warming is happening and that it is the fault of humankind. 34 out of 35. So who's the odd one out? It's the National Institution of Petroleum Geologists. There's a surprise, isn't it? And they've had such an outcry from their members that their 2010 position statement was that it was all a load of tosh, but they've had to back off it and say, and they admit it because of an outcry from our members, we now don't feel that we're in a qualified position, that our discipline does not qualify us to speak on global warming. If you go to the websites and the information for those who are opposed to the idea, it's tosh. There's no science there. And the giveaway is, throughout these rants, you'll see things like the words like socialist and liberal used every other sentence. They see it as a left-wing conspiracy, because the only way to prevent global warming is to curb our consumption. And if you curb consumption, then you present politicians whose whole life work is free markets and consumption. You put them out of work. So it is a conspiracy, but it's a political conspiracy. And why does global warming matter? If you go through well, let me tell you why it's important with animals, because animals are the second biggest source of global warming after power generation and consumption. But actually their true figure is much worse than this, much higher, because the forests that are being felled for animal farming and the soil that's being degraded because of them, they are the two biggest sinks, that and the oceans, the two biggest sinks for absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. So not only are animals the second cause, they're also destroying the sponge-like ability of the planet to draw in CO2. So their true effect is much, much higher than that. And it's the biggest worry is you can go through the what happens at 1 degree, what happens at 2 degrees. When you get up to what happens at 3 degrees, you might as well have a party, to be honest, because you've started on a process that is almost certainly incapable of being stopped. And it has this whole thing has the potential to make the Earth uninhabitable. And it will start, of course, where it always starts, with the poorest people in the world, and those in the northern latitudes will be the last to suffer. But what the concern is, one of the things that the point at which it reaches there are several points of positive feedback or points of no return. One of those is when the soil, instead of absorbing CO2, starts to release it. And in Arctic, the permafrost of the Arctic and the seabed of the Arctic Ocean are locked billions and billions of tons of methane, billions of tons. If the permafrost starts to melt, this methane is released, which causes more global warming, which defrosts more tundra, which produces more methane, and you have this circle. It can't be stopped and it can't be controlled, and that's called positive feedback. And it's the same with the seabed of the Arctic Ocean, billions of tons of methane. And I'm sorry to report that the process is in its very, very, very early stages, but it has begun. That methane is being released from the Arctic Ocean, it's being measured, very small quantities, but it's the start of the process. And that's why, if you read scientific reports now, scientists have always annoyed me because they will do a piece of profound research, say nothing about it, shove it to one side, and go on to the next bit. They're not doing that anymore. They're speaking up. And you can hear the desperation in their voices, in their reports now on global warming. Because they know that this is the greatest threat to the planet. Now, all the other things that I've mentioned, left to run their course, are also enormous threats. I don't know how big they are, but they are huge threats. And again, it's always the poorest people who are eking out an existence who are the first to suffer. And when you go to developing countries, I mean, as a kid, I left school at 16 and joined the Merchant Navy, and I couldn't bear the thought of any more education. And I sailed largely down the West African coast. And it's very hard to comprehend the fine knife edge that people live on in countries. I've been to many more impoverished countries since then. And their existence is literally hand to mouth, day to day. So anything which disrupts that threatens their life and their children's lives. And it's politics. That was the start, if you like, of my politicization. The cargoes that we brought back were, we took everything out there from aspirins to railway engines, and we brought back 2 cargoes. Logs, 5-ton chunks of rainforest trees. Nobody was talking about the rainforest. I didn't understand what that was, but we were bringing back rainforest trees from Ghana, Nigeria. It's all gone now, nearly all gone. And cocoa. Now, what I was aware of, that in a good year, a cocoa farmer in Ghana made enough to feed his kids. In a bad year, they all starved. The people who import the cocoa and buy it and sell it, the cocoa merchants, live in Isha, drive BMWs and send their kids to school. And I could not help seeing the political juxtaposition of this. It's a parasitic relationship, and it still exists, and it's still why developing countries are allowing their best agricultural land to be used to grow fodder for our animals, why rainforests are being chopped down, and why deserts are degrading. It is the same political parasitic relationship. Now, how we get out of this, you as individuals can do something immediately. You stop eating meat and dairy, and you have removed yourself from that cycle. And in case you think that's a rather futile exercise, the number of vegans has increased, according to Mintel, over the last decade from 100,000 to 1 million. Now that's a rapid growth. But also I would ask you to proselytize, don't let people get away with saying, oh, it's all a load of old tosh, global warming. It's not. And do what you can. But the final position is going to be a political one. And most of the power has been taken from, what's the first thing that the IMF does? Demands that people sell off their public services, their water, their electricity, to put it into the hands of capital. So capital now controls the world. It is frighteningly powerful, and it ain't going to surrender that power willingly. And I think it's afraid it's going to be rather messy, and the Spains and the Greases are going to get much, much, much worse. But what they desperately need is some political understanding of what it is they're fighting for. And it isn't just to reopen new factories, it's to readjust our life cycle. And there's a very, very good, instead of making cars that you throw away after 10 years, you make cars that last for 30, 40 years. You make parts that can be remachined and not just thrown away in a new part. So we have to move away from, this is nothing to do with what I was talking about, really. But it is related. We have to move away from consumption to conservation. And actually there was a very good book written back in the 60s by Schumacher called Small is Beautiful. And he was saying what we need is not mass production, we need intermediate technology where people make things with their hands and they repair them, and you have industries which are small and locally based. You know, and yet in everything we do we're following the opposite, and farms are being accreted into these huge mega areas, and so it is a whole process that affects every aspect of our lives. And you can do something about it on an individual level, but also I think you're going to have to be prepared to get on the streets eventually and risk a whack on the head, because I can't see it being resolved absolutely peacefully. But if you think back to the introduction of GM, genetically modified crops, into Britain, the government, industry, they all thought, woohoo, nobody's going to object to this. Wonderful. I don't know where it came from, but the British public just suddenly said no. And I mean, I just could not believe it. They just said no, and it's still no. So people can have an enormous impact, and they can change things, and that is proof of it. Thank you very much.